Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Castlevania Circle of the Moon. In the last part, we started off the game and got decently deep into the starting area of the game, the Catacombs. And now we're going to progress through, fight our first boss fight, and then enter the deeper reaches of the castle, where a majority of the game lies ahead of us. Not for nothing, I think out of all the Metroidvania starting areas in this specific franchise, the Catacombs is definitely one of the longer ones on a first visit, if only because there's many more side paths for you to take than, say, Dracula's Castle had in Symphony, or the equivalent areas do in Harmony or Aria. This room in specific, you might want to get through in a pretty decent clip, because the gremlins here are infinite, which makes them decent for experience farming, I suppose, but it's just not worth it. You could theoretically farm from these guys, though, because they have like a 0.5% chance to drop a Mind Restore, which is effectively an ether out of Final Fantasy. Restores your MP outright in the case you're getting a little too reckless with your DSS card usage, and having a stock from those from early game can be helpful. With that said, depending on how you build your intellect, that's not going to be the most important thing long term. Speaking of farming though, in the case you really want to get some good accessories as soon as you can, this room might be able to help you out. The hoppers here have a low, and by low I mean like I think 1.25% chance of dropping a gauntlet, which boosts Nathan's strength by 15, so it's just a stronger wristband. And not for nothing, considering you're coming up on the first boss, it might be worth it, but I'd say it's more worth it for the levels you'd be gaining at that point. Speaking of which, time for our first boss battle in the game. This is Cerberus. Cerberus only really has 3 attacks, but you want to especially be careful of that pounce whenever it leans downward, because that goes about 2/3 of the way across the arena and can really surprise you. Otherwise, its main 2 attacks depend on its fur color, as every now and then it'll howl and either attempt to change its color or just keep it the same. When it's blue, its magic-based attack effectively is to send 2 lightning orbs out to either side of it and have them patrol back and forth slightly. And if it's red, it's going to jump on one of the lower tier platforms on either side of the screen and do a laser that covers most of the arena, similar to a certain boss from Mega Man Zero. If you have the axe sub-weapon, that's actively the attack you really want to see, as you can very easily get below it and just spam the axe to get at least 2 or 3 hits in at a time, depending on where you place it in the sprite. Just be careful about where you place yourself in the arena, because if you place yourself against either door, it's very easy for the Cerberus to put you into a corner that's hard to escape from without taking some damage, but it really depends on how much health you have to begin with at that point. That's the first boss down, and unlike most other Metroidvania Castlevanias, we don't even get like a health orb from the boss dying that'll help restore your health to max and all that. This is like the only one of those that doesn't do that. Our reward for being the Cerberus, though, is our next movement upgrade, the double. Another jump can be performed while in midair, a double jump just outright. That allows us to reach new heights and actively progress down a pathway I didn't enter in a couple rooms back. But worth noting, there are some items I've already grabbed up by this point even that are easier to grab with the double jump, especially the one I used the Ice Whip to grab last time. But I ultimately am trying to do this game as efficiently as I can, sort of. Some of the eccentricities of Circle of the Moon between DSS card farming and some other things means there's not exactly a immediately super efficient route that takes care of everything in the best order you can, like there are in some other Metroidvanias. But you just kind of got to deal with it as you go, you know? The mummies here and their sarcophagi are actually very good for experience farming in early game, by the way. If you want to gain another level or so before Cerberus, especially if you let multiple sarcophagi get on screen, just be careful, because I think you can eventually get enough mummies running if you do things correctly, where the game starts to stutter a little bit. They can also drop the cotton clothes item, which I think we got one a moment ago. If you for some reason didn't get a leather armor earlier, putting that on before Cerberus can also be recommended, because I think that boosts your defense by 20 or so, as opposed to the leather armor's 30, I want to say. That's especially worth noting because, not for nothing, as you go throughout the game, you're going to find a lot more wrist armor than you are body armor. There are still plenty of body armors, but they're just either rarer drops or from further spaced apart enemies, depending on how you're going about the world. So watch out for that all the same. At this point, though, I might as well actively talk about my experience with Circle of the Moon. I did not have this game growing up. I didn't play this until probably late middle school, early high school or so. Via emulation after really getting deep into the genre, more so than I already was through playing Zero Mission and Fusion growing up. And at the time, I thought it was alright. I remember at the time having 3 distinct takeaways from the game. 1, the music is fantastic, of course, in the Castlevania. There's barely ever bad music, really. But I especially really like the Catacombs theme, which is Awake, which is Nathan's own theme. It's just such a really nice theme to start off the adventure with. But the other 2 things I remember thinking were, I really didn't like the DSS system, even more so than I don't like it now. That's because I only found maybe 1/3 of the cards at most on that playthrough, because there's so little indication about what enemies will drop in unless you farm every enemy repeatedly. And even then, just given the drop rates of some cards, not exactly the most likely to find one. Oh, hey, another card. Speaking of which, This is the Mandragora card. This is an attribute card that gives the action card a plant element. So now we actively have a Vine Whip that also has a decent spread at the end of it for the petals. Does a little more damage, but of course there's some enemies that are going to be resistant to it outright in some form or manner. There are multiple damage types in the game, pretty much entirely dictated by what color Nathan flashes when he takes damage. Largely, if an enemy is like a plant, they're going to be weak to fire type deal. If they look like they might be on fire, they might take more damage from ice and all that jazz. It really just kind of depends in what you find more comfortable in terms of an attack rate and pattern and all that, I honestly find. Now, I went back around that circle for a health up, but I am going to come back quickly into parts of the catacombs because there's one room in specific we can now fully explore now that we have the double jump, and I want both of the item pickups within there just to give me a bit more of an edge here in early game. Largely, I would say that Circle of the Moon is a game that gets easier as you go through it, as long as you're actively going out of the way to farm for DSS cards or enemy drops here and again. But that also requires knowledge of what enemies might drop, which on a first playthrough, you might not even be farming the right enemies for. I'd say Circle of the Moon is easily the roughest first playthrough in any of the games in this genre for this franchise, period. The only one that might be as rough on a first run, depending on what you're doing, is probably Order of Ecclesia, because while that game is a lot more straightforward with its gimmick and all that jazz, I just find the amount of damage enemies can do if you're not going out of the way to farm for side quests and all that kind of rough as well. But even then, in comparison, if you don't do the side quests in Ecclesia, you at least know you're not interacting with a part of the game. Meanwhile, there's some cards in this game you just will not see, period, unless you know to look for them, which I think is a little bit more annoying as an idea. Thus leading for a rougher first playthrough because you might just not know what's going on, where the gimmick is, you haven't seen a card in a while, things like that. Which, at the very least, Circle of the Moon does play itself pretty smart in that no card combos are ever required for progression. Anything that's required for progression is just found in the level design. It's not a drop or anything like that. Similarly to Symphony of the Night and the games that came afterwards. But that also means there's such less focus on the DSS system in the game where it can feel kind of superfluous at times as well. Either way, going back to what I was talking about like 2 or 3 minutes ago, the third thing I remember taking away from my first playthrough of this game is that I remember just really not liking how Nathan controlled compared to protagonists that came before or even after him. Because obviously, comparing him to Alucard's just going to be an uphill battle because that's a PlayStation game and Alucard's one of the best controlling characters in gaming, period. But even compared to Just and Soma from the latter 2 GBA games, Nathan's got a little bit more of that Belmont stiffness going on despite not being a Belmont. And you can really feel that in his walking speed especially, and the dash does help with that, but the double tapping gets awkward after a while. We've got a Iron Maiden blocking off that path, by the way, can't get through that yet. Keep that in the back of your head for a good while in the game, because that's going to be taunting us for a while. Now, also, I cannot tell if I'm just imagining it or what, but something about the camera in this game feels off compared to Symphony as well as the games that came after it. And I can't tell if it's maybe a factor of maybe like it's more zoomed out and thus your sharper movements make it move faster or what. Because Nathan is definitely a smaller sprite on the screen than Just or Soma is. But there's just something about it that feels like the movement is off. And I cannot put it quite into words. It's a feel thing, I think is the best way to put it. I do get used to it every playthrough, but the first like half hour of every playthrough of Circle of the Moon is a little bit shaky due to that for some reason. So, a few moments ago, specifically in the room where we fought the mummies, I actually got my second favorite sub-weapon in the game, the good old Holy Water. This works pretty much the same way it has in every game in the series up to this point. You throw it downward at an angle, it lands on the floor, cracks open, and lights on fire. Any enemy within that fire takes damage as long as the fire persists. What makes that especially useful in this entry in specific is that whenever the enemy is in the Holy Water, they're also effectively trapped and cannot move because they're getting hit basically every frame. And given that this game really likes having larger sized enemies that move pretty quickly and do heavy damage, keeping them in one place to gain some distance or to keep yourself safe from damage, period, is a very effective strategy for survival. This is especially effective against the armor or knight enemy lines like the axe armor we saw a few moments ago that gave us the Mandragora card, or even the demon line the Earth Demon belonged to, assuming they swoop low enough. Due to that, it's also especially a useful strategy for farming those enemies for their drops, be it experience, a DSS card, or especially equipment pieces. On that note, I should probably mention that basically every enemy in the game has 2 drops, a common and a rare one. The rare one is usually where the DSS card is for the enemy in question. And worth noting, if you proc an enemy to drop a DSS card after you've already collected it, they don't actually drop the card. They instead drop a large heart worth 5 hearts. On that note, welcome to the audience room. We're going to be here pretty frequently throughout the game. This might as well be the central hub to this specific variant of Dracula's castle, especially the western half of it. Because the way that this castle is structured is a little weird in that a majority of the game's areas, or at least their entrances, are placed on the western side of the map. Meanwhile, the eastern side of the map is more often than not just a destination rather than an entrance. And it does feel kind of weird due to that on a first run, because it's so heavily weighted towards one side compared to most other Castlevania maps. But hey, at least it makes it simple and quick to potentially find where you need to go, because you'll get blockaded by certain gates in one direction or another. The audience room is also a little bit funny in that if you actively do something a little wrong here, you might cause yourself a couple of minutes worth of backtracking. Namely due to the positioning on the map at the moment. If you take a look, we're actively coming up on a kind of familiar area the start of the game. Specifically, in the room to the bottom right here is the room where we actively fell that Dracula's resurrected in. If you fall down that hole, you gotta backtrack through the catacombs to get back here. It's locked. We can't open that door until pretty much the very end of the game. You might as well consider that your end game destination. We also can't get past this door until later, so we're blocked out from this route. At this point, though, I do want to talk a little bit about this game's story and specific things about it, but to do that, I think the best thing to do first is actually read the prologue from the manual. So, starting off, the year is 1830. In an ancient castle on the outskirts of the Austrian Empire, a demon lord that would unite the powers of darkness was being resurrected at the hand of a fiend yearning for chaos. At this demonic castle, Camilla, one of Dracula's minions, began the incantation of a ritual to bring her lord Dracula back to life. Dracula being mentioned twice in that sentence feels a little bit awkward, I won't lie. The vampire hunter Morris and his 2 apprentices, Nathan and Hugh, sensed an abnormality in the balance of nature and rushed to prevent Dracula's unholy reemergence. That unholy monster must never return. However, they arrived too late to prevent Dracula's return from his confinement. Dracula used his magical powers to imprison Morris and cast Nathan and Hugh into a graveyard underneath the demonic castle. Together, the two began to search the castle in order to vanquish Dracula and to rescue their master. Together? Hugh abandoned us, frame 1? What are you talking about, manual? By the way, if you combine that info with the relatively thin bios they have for the characters in the manual on the character pages, where they talk about Nathan inheriting the hunter whip, his parents dying during the last time Dracula was banished because they worked alongside Morris, and that's why Morris taught Nathan, you might notice something's a little missing from this narrative in general: the Belmonts. That's because they just don't exist in this world, at least seemingly as far as we know. Circle of the Moon is one of the few games in the franchise in a different continuity that just doesn't involve Belmonts, period. Most other titles like that in the franchise, like the 2 N64 titles, Dracula X on Super Nintendo, heck, Super Castlevania 4 technically even falls into this due to that being a remake of Castlevania 1, actively do have Belmonts involved, but not this one. Due to that, this game can come across a bit more as an oddity compared to other adventures, though I'd say it's far from the most bizarre feeling entering the franchise in that regard. Despite it being still very Belmont involved, I'd say Castlevania Judgment is far and away the most bizarre the franchise ever got with stuff like that. Though, not for nothing, referencing games I've already done LPs of, this game taking place in 1830 does mean that if it was in main canon, the Belmonts not being involved wouldn't be too shocking, because this takes place after Symphony of the Night in that regard, and after Symphony, the Belmonts take a step back due to Richter's actions in Symphony, handing over the Vampire Killer to the Morris clan at some point or another, and that's why Bloodlines takes place the way it does, as well as Portrait of Ruin, getting ahead of ourselves here. So the spot where this could exist is there, but it's just not there in the main canon. On that note, I should probably mention, yeah, it's been a while since I did one of these for Castlevania outright. The last one of these I did was Symphony of the Night, which was an LP I did in early 2015, so over a decade ago. I've been meaning to do more of these games in this franchise for a while. I just never really found the time between other games I was doing, honestly, is the best way to put it. And for a good while there, I only really ever had intentions of doing specifically Aria, probably Portrait, and Ecclesia, really. Because, frankly, Circle of the Moon and Harmony didn't put the best first impressions on me back when. But having recently done the streams of all of those games, I was like, yeah, no, I should probably actively tackle them all at some point just to actively give the full picture, because I think playing through all of these games in release order actually does give a pretty interesting picture for how they changed development priorities and what they wanted to focus on one regard or another. Actually, very similarly to why I ended up playing the Souls games on stream in the order I did, because I forget if I even talked about that really, because I did that in, frankly, the most bizarre order possible, because I started with Bloodborne, then I went into Lies of P technically on my own time, into Dark Souls 3, into Sekiro into Elden Ring, I think, from there, into Dark Souls 1, then Dark Souls 2, and then Demon Souls last. Which with those games in specific, it's because I didn't want to get too used to one thing or another, given how those games can change things up. But going from Symphony into Circle of the Moon into the other GBA and DS games, I think paints a more interesting picture about how development shifted and where priorities went than just playing them in any kind of bizarre order. That's kind of the thing I like about playing through a series chronologically, is you do get those pictures on what they maybe wanted to change focus on and all that jazz. And you can also see where they went, okay, maybe we went too far in one direction or another. And just to use Souls as an example there, I adore Dark Souls 3, but man, I kind of wish they had leaned more into the energy Dark Souls 2 had in some experimental regards. And not for nothing, they kind of did eventually, because, man, Elden Ring has a lot more Dark Souls 2 DNA than people probably like to admit. Either way, at this point, we've actively entered the outer wall, which is one of the smallest areas in the game. It's actively only made up of 3 rooms, and 2 of them are very large, and one of them is that small secret room we were just in. We can actively fully explore this one more or less right now because I actively have access to the Ice Whip, but if you didn't get the Serpent card earlier, you might need to wait until later for this. Worth noting, there's actively another card combo that can do an effect similar to the Ice Whip, that it can actively freeze enemies in place and you can use it as a platform. But the Serpent Whip is the earliest you can actively get something like this. The really rough thing about climbing rooms like this in this specific entry is that Nathan, when he gets hit, especially midair, he does suffer some pretty nasty knockback like that, which in more cases than not just causes you to lose some progress, but it definitely can be very annoying all the same. He can also suffer similar knockback if he gets hit by a strong enough attack on the ground, but that's nowhere near as annoying. The issue with the knockback, I think, in this specific entry is that because Nathan's only main method of attack is the whip, it feels like you have very limited options for approaching enemies when they can very easily just hit you once and send you flying backwards. Some weapons do help alleviate this from time to time, yes, and there are some DSS combos that can really help with that. Heck, there's one especially that just almost outright removes it. But doing that feels like you're putting a really poor quality bandage or some scotch tape over the issue rather than trying to fix what's really feeling wrong here. And honestly, this is an issue that's more prevalent in early to mid game more than anything, especially if you get certain DSS combos earlier. But it's also an issue I think will be fixed if Nathan's whip flail wasn't more of just spinning the whip in place and actively worked more like it did in Castlevania 4 or even pretty much any other Metroidvania where you play as a whip user outright. But honestly, not for nothing, there's a chance that also has more to do with certain behind-the-scenes factors that the game will start talking about probably in the next part or two. Coming up here, though, we have our first proper warp room. Like Symphony of the Night, you press up on this and they'll teleport you in sequence from one to another. You can use that one off the bat and actively get teleported back here towards the start of the game, but we need to actively discover all of the warp rooms before we can teleport to them. You cannot choose which warp room you teleport to, though. You go through them in a set order. Specifically, counting the room we just teleported to near the start of the game as Warp Room 1, you teleport through them in order of relative area level. So the last warp room in the chain is the one in the highest level area near the end of the game. Using those efficiently can really help mitigate some issues with backtracking through the castle. With that said, I do think pretty much every other game in this genre for this franchise actively places warp rooms better at large. Getting a little ahead of ourselves here, pretty much all the warp rooms in this game are on the top half of the castle. And not for nothing, this is a rather top-heavy castle layout-wise compared to some others in the franchise. But I do think they could have added maybe one warp room you can only access with a later power-up somewhere in the general vicinity of the catacombs to make getting back to the lower half of the map slightly less annoying. Not that it's very annoying to begin with, but it would have helped a good little bit. I actually have one specific place in mind where I think it could have really worked, but I'll talk more about that when we actually reach that point later in the LP. Also, worth noting, the way this LP is largely structured is I'm going to end a part leaving or entering a save room. There's only really like 1 or 2 parts later on in the LP where that's not exactly true, and that's more just due to the scale of certain areas in comparison to what we've done prior. Also, 2 specific enemies to note in this general vicinity. We'll be farming one next time. The electric skeleton we saw a moment ago, they can actually drop a DSS card, and we're going to be farming that at the start of the next part, I believe. But the devil towers here, in the case you're taking a lot of damage or you have some relatively low defense armors, farming them for a little bit can be pretty helpful, because they actively do drop potions as their rare drop. And compared to other rare drops, it's decently common. You're just going to get a lot of wristbands along the way. It's nice to keep in mind, especially because a basic potion in an early game does cure enough HP where it's worth having them around. Just the drop rates are a little bit rough on those. And actively, the drop rates are one of my bigger issues with this game. On top of certain item placements, I'll probably start talking about 2 parts from now, if I had to guess. I want to save that for a mid-game topic, just for reasons that are more tied to what we've done already at that point. So this specific large room actually has an enemy that can be pretty useful to farm depending on your wants and needs for stats. Specifically, there's a little zombie-like guy towards the floor called the Clinking Man. There's several of them in the room. Both of their drops are equipment, and they're both pretty interesting depending on the point in the game you get them. Their common drop is the Prison Garb, which actively raises Nathan's defense by 20 and his strength by 5, giving you a little bit more of an attack boost than some of the other early game armors. But their rare drop, and by rare I mean rare, it is about a 1% drop I believe, is the Miracle Armband, which raises Nathan's luck by 10. The luck stat dictates a couple of minor things across each game largely, but the main thing is they dictate drop rates. Specifically, largely, the higher your luck, the higher the drop rate. With that said, usually every point of luck is such a minuscule raise to how common a drop will happen that it's really not super worth putting all your focus into a luck stat. Specifically, I think I wrote down what the drop formula was somewhere here. Yes, there it is. The drop rate in this game is actively equal to the base drop rate times your luck divided by 100. So using the luck stat I think I saw I had earlier in the video of 180 as reference, and the Miracle Armband's 1% base drop rate, that item's active drop rate is closer to 1.8%, nearly double the drop rates, which means your luck does actively matter a little bit more in this game than some of the others, especially certain DS games. But it's not exactly something you should super focus on unless you're actively just having the worst time trying to farm items. Getting a bit ahead of ourselves here, though, if you're trying to actively farm items, I would recommend using a DSS combo that boosts your luck rather than trying to find equipment that boosts your luck unless you're super desperate, as the feedback loop usually becomes needing higher luck to farm higher luck items, and it just becomes a monstrosity of trying to find the next highest luck item, and I just do not like doing it. The real rough thing is that basically every single one of these Metroidvania Castlevanias does have some really good enemy drops for your stats or for your damage. It's just that sometimes they get such obtuse low drop rates on top of however the luck works in the game that it just does not feel worth the farm in some cases. But then you get cases like the Chrysogrim and Symphony, where if you get it, you win the game pretty much. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 3, we're going to continue on exploring the audience room, finding the boss of the area in the process, and progressing on to our next main area. See you guys then.